Hi, Trisha Reed here, consciouslypresent.com, trauma-informed recovery coach, energy healing practitioner, and author. In today's video, I'm going to talk a bit about our trauma bonds, what they are, how to start recognizing them, and why it's vital that we do so if we are determined to exit this construct or matrix. So, first of all, just what is a trauma bond? Well, simply put, it's the bond that we form with another, with any relationship we have that is based in control, manipulation, exploitation, and abuse. And specifically, the abusive behavior by the other is intermittent, alternating between times of normalcy and times of abuse. We are given intermittent periods of peace or relative safety, and we actually become biologically addicted to these periods of peace, essentially like chasing the dragon, as we keep enduring the abuse that gets reinforced by the other over and over again, while we convince ourselves that it's all going to get better, or we can just love the other person enough to heal them. In a trauma bond, you become hyper-vigilant, feeling that you are constantly walking on eggshells, always on alert, while your body remains in bracing patterns that eventually manifest physical symptoms. During the periods of peace or relative safety, you might let your guard down and often find yourself blindsided when the abusive person blows up at you for no reason. We tend to start thinking it must have been something that we said or did, or that we're the problem, or that we can do better. And before you know it, we've become a human pretzel, all contorted into unimaginable shapes and positions to try to stop the other person from abusing us, and living for the breadcrumbs that they give us, thinking we can be good enough to earn those brief, sparse, loving, and peaceful moments. In many cases, those peaceful times aren't even joyful or loving, but simply moments when they leave us alone and they're not abusing us in some way. And we start to associate that with love and goodness. In cases of parental trauma bonding, this hot and cold dynamic tends to start in our infancy, and we never learn that love is safe, as the very person that we have to rely on for survival, which includes love, is the very person we have to protect ourselves from. This generally creates a disorganized attachment style, which makes connection with others very difficult as we go through life, as we tend to attract others who match our own parents' patterns, unwittingly looking for the safety in these relationships that we never found from our parents. We also might develop a fawning survival strategy in which we have the need to please and appease others, and this gets exploited by those who play the roles of victimizers and abusers in this realm. A trauma bond oscillates between hot and cold, with intermittent reinforcements of love bombing and abuse, which conditions our brains and our nervous systems to give the abuser control over us, just like Pavlov's dogs, trained and conditioned to salivate whenever the bell rang, as they'd been trained to expect food with the ringing of the bell. Even when food was no longer presented with the ringing bell, the dogs still salivated because of the changes that had happened in their brains and nervous systems with the conditioning. We are likewise trained and conditioned by the abusers, figuratively salivating when they show kindness or tender moments, even if that just means it's a moment when they're not abusing us and we're walking on eggshells, embracing patterns, ready to contort ourselves into something that isn't us to appease the abuser, while we become like empty shells of who we used to be. Or in the case of parental trauma bonds, we don't even get to discover who we might have been, because controlling, abusive parents told us who we were from infancy, and we dared not ever question that or explore for ourselves. You can think of it in terms of a punishment and reward system meant to manipulate and control you into believing or being or doing someone else's bidding. When you comply or conform, you get rewarded. When you set boundaries and say no or otherwise disobey or fail to comply, you get punished. What does this teach us? What do we learn about ourselves and the world we live in when we're controlled and manipulated in this way? Well, we learn that we are the opposite of what we truly are, and that we're not allowed to have a self or express that self to be our true self, and that someone or something else is our authority that we have to give our power to. When unhealthy, toxic parents who never learned how to think for themselves perpetuate this programming onto their children, we no longer have a human society, but rather a society of sheep and wolves. Those who play the roles of victims and those who victimize them. Those who only know how to look to others to be their authority and saviors, and those who are all too happy to feed on the power given to them by those who have no idea that they are actually divine and their own authority. We often see this play out in the family dynamics in dysfunctional families, as each sibling behaves according to their attachment styles, survival strategies, coping mechanisms, biology, and roles assigned to them by their parents, especially if the parents play favorites, scapegoating one child while overvaluing another, especially while gaslighting the children by maintaining the blaring lie that they love all their children equally. By the time a child starts school, he or she is already primed to obey, to continue forming trauma bonds with others, teachers, and other kids at school, where the trauma bond programming and conditioning continues and is taken over by the state. Comply and conform, or be a social outcast, judged and shunned by your peers. Obey or be punished. And this goes on all throughout life, through the religious churches, extended family, college, into the workplace, the legal systems, the medical systems, corporations, into romantic relationships and marriages, and even within ourselves. And the cycle repeats until we become aware of the trauma bonds we've formed and decide to put an end to them. The first step to take in ending trauma bonds is to become aware of them, to recognize them for what they are. This must include becoming aware of what is abuse, control, and exploitation, most of which has been normalized in this society. This can feel quite uncomfortable as we go through the process of asking difficult questions and being honest with ourselves about the answers and feeling all the uncomfortable emotions that come up that we don't want to feel, which is why so many people avoid doing the inner work of healing. It takes time and work, and most people have never been taught how to handle feeling their feelings without being overwhelmed by them. And I encourage you to head over to my site, consciouslypresent.com, and check out my course if you'd like to learn how to do this for yourself. So exactly what do our parental trauma bonds have to do with exiting this construct or matrix that we're in? Well, everything. After all, to children, our parents are God. As we grow older, our parents become less godlike to us. But we just transfer all that power from our parents to some God figure that we fear and obey, often without question, without noticing the psychopathic behavior of this so-called God, as told in the religious texts. Instead of questioning the insanity displayed by this being, we form a trauma bond with it, fearing judgment and eternal damnation, hellfire, piously obeying the ideas we've been conditioned with to avoid hell and go to heaven to be with that God. We think when we leave these bodies at the time of physical death, we're going to meet our loving Heavenly Father, at which time we will be judged, and hope that we're given at least some table scraps from this being, rather than being sent down to the devil for eternal judgment and torment. Other religious beliefs teach that God will put us in paradise on earth, or God will murder us at Armageddon. And the condition to be met is that we must believe as God's organization on earth tells us to. That if we question what we're told or believe differently, that God will punish us by murdering us. So rather than to think for ourselves and question the sanity of these notions, we stay in a trauma bond with this being, with the idea of God that isn't even our own idea of God. This trauma bond is shared with others, as it is used to police and judge each other based on keeping each other in check. As we find ourselves in churches and communities of people who behave just like their psychopathic God, and we form and stay in trauma bonds with these communities. But what actually happens when we leave these bodies at the time of physical death? Isn't it amazing just how many different experiences have been shared by people who have had near-death experiences and out-of-body travels? There are all sorts of beings we encounter, and they all seem to tell us that we have to come back here. Isn't that interesting? Why do they seem not to want to tell us the truth about who and what we are? That we are divine and sovereign? That we are the emanations of our divine source? Or as Greg Braden has told us, our very DNA is coded in ancient languages, literally, that we are God eternal in the body. Who or what would have an interest in keeping the knowledge of who and what we actually are hidden from us? Who or what would have the interest in keeping us dumbed down and ignorant to our inherent power? And why? Who or what would have us believe that we are bad or evil if we start believing in the truth of who and what we are? Who or what would want us to be afraid of claiming our inherent divinity? To answer these questions, let's ask, why do controllers and abusers form trauma bonds with us? What do they get out of it? In short, the answer to that is fuel, energy, food, loosh. They have none of their own. They need ours because we are the divine source. Trauma bonds are actually quite parasitic in nature, in general. The relationships are based in the attempt to get energy from the other person in some way. The narcissistic predator in the relationship uses tactics to hook you and pull you in, such as love bombing and idealization. Then they suddenly start to devalue you, which is like being stung with venom. It causes confusion. And if you don't recognize it the first time it happens, you're there trying to understand what just happened and giving the abuser the benefit of the doubt while chasing after the love bombs, and before you know it, you find yourself controlled, contorting yourself to please them. This drains your energy while they feed on it. Eventually, once they have sucked you dry, after using tactics like breadcrumbing you, throwing you scraps of the occasional love and tenderness, or just simply giving you crumbs of non-abuse or leaving you alone, while secretly scoping out and finding a new source of energetic supply, they discard you. Once the relationship is over, you don't just go back to being the person you were before at the start. You don't go back to being okay. You've been conditioned into walking on eggshells. Your nervous system and brain has been changed, rewired. You're hypervigilant. You go into bracing patterns and complex trauma. You find yourself ruminating and unable to move forward, stuck, even wishing that the abusive person would come back. This is even more difficult for the person who was trauma bonded in childhood by a parent, because the abuse triggers the old unhealed wounds from early childhood and keeps them bleeding. With a parental trauma bond, you may never have learned who you are in the first place, as you were conditioned from infancy to take care of the parent's needs, rather than having your needs tended to by the parent as they were meant to be. You may very likely have been conditioned to stay home, near the parent, to become your parent's caretaker, or to have you dependent on your parent so that they could keep you around. And this may have been done by the parent in ways of telling you that you'll never amount to anything, or gaslit into believing that the parent knows more than you do, or that the parent is eternally smarter than you are, with intermittent reinforcement when the parent is kind to you, when you selflessly tend to their needs, but verbally or emotionally punished, such as being told how selfish you are, when you take some time to tend to your own needs. As we are hardwired to look to our parents for safety, security, approval, validation, and love, and even for our most basic survival needs, it is especially traumatizing when the parent withholds these from you, and you have not learned how to feel safe within your own body or to validate and love and approve of yourself. Furthermore, the bond between parent and child also involves brain chemicals. It is biological. And we've become addicted to these brain chemicals as we seek our next hit of oxytocin, dopamine, and adrenaline, all of which are secreted in the trauma bonds. So we're not just programmed and conditioned to seek out friends and partners who are similar to our parents in how they treat us, but biologically wired to as well. We become addicted to our own thought patterns and emotions, and because of how our neurochemistry works, as trauma splinters us off into various inner parts of ourselves, we even form trauma bonds within ourselves. Think of how you might punish yourself about something and then reward yourself with the same intermittent reinforcement you experienced from your dysfunctional or narcissistic parent when you were a child. Do we even realize when we are narcissistically abusing ourselves? Think of how eating disorders work, for example. This is one of the most common trauma bonds we have within ourselves, especially in this society full of people who are conditioned that they're not enough and can't be acceptable to some other person unless they look a certain way. Where did we learn such an insane notion such as this? Ultimately, the subject of trauma bonds is a huge one, and it's vital that we begin to recognize them and work on getting rid of them while we're here. It's not just for the purpose of healing and living happier lives while we're here, but even more importantly, for what comes beyond this life. The parasitic imposter entities that run this AI construct that we're in, they gaslight us. They pretend to be God or Jesus or whatever deity we've been programmed to give our power and authority to. And they have a vested interest in making sure we stay in this construct. Why? Because they have no source of their own. Think about it. If they were God, would they need us? Would they need us to feed them? Would they need to keep us here if they were God? No. No, they need us because we are the source and they have none of their own. They have no source but us. We are the divine source that unwittingly fuel this realm and feed the parasites. They know that if we knew, if we remembered who and what we truly are, we would simply withdraw our power and leave, and they would starve. So they use the parental trauma bond programming, the victim-victimizer paradigm, to keep us believing that they are the authority, that we'll be punished for being evil if we challenge that authority, that we are powerless, sinful, and here to worship them. Just as a dysfunctional, narcissistic parent will condition us to stay near to them and take care of them, not to leave, to live our own lives. It's the same dynamic. So one of the keys to exiting this construct is to heal the parental trauma bonds that we may have. So what if we didn't have dysfunctional parents? What if we didn't have a narcissistic parent? What if we don't think we have a parental trauma bond? Well, we probably still do. Why? Because of the system we live in. Do you believe that you have to apply for a license to do something such as to drive a car, to get yourself to work, for example? How about paying taxes? Do you believe that you have to exchange your physical energy and time for a wage and then have that taxed when there isn't even a law to show you that says you must? Do you believe that we should have to pay for food and shelter? How about water? Do we not see the exploitation and abuse when we're charged money not only for the water we drink, which is necessary for life, but also for the toxic poisons that corporations dump into our water supply so that they don't have to pay the hefty costs of cleaning up after themselves? To just put it in our water supply instead and charge us for it. Do we actually think this is normal and okay? If so, why do you believe that? Do you believe the government has actual authority over you? These are yet more forms of parental trauma bonds that most of us aren't even aware of. These are more ways in which we are punished or rewarded by the parasitic system of control we live in here. Again, with intermittent reinforcement to keep us controlled and drained while they consume our energy. We must also learn to recognize our trauma bonds with this system. And that includes our trauma bonds with technology and the technocrats who censor us and who wish to install chips in our heads and social credit systems to reward us for compliance and punish us for standing in our own integrity, authenticity, and power, as well as the control systems that wish to make us completely dependent on them. Do you think that AI applications are really here to help us? Or maybe they're intended to make us dependent on them while we lose the ability to think for ourselves, while they take all our knowledge, all our experience, all our wisdom, and spit it back out at us as if these applications thought up the brilliant answers themselves, while we're gaslit into thinking that these artificial systems are superior to us and give up on ourselves before we even discover our true divinity and our inherent abilities that come from our spirit. It's time to recognize these trauma bonds and take our power back. Ultimately, when we reach the point of body death, the more we have healed our trauma bonds while we've been here, the less we are able to be manipulated and controlled into seeing these archontic parasitic beings as our authority, as God. The more easily we will be able to face ourselves as we go through a life review. The more likely we are to be able to stand up to a false God and say no when we're told we have to come back to this realm to live another lifetime, to pay back karma, which is another lie and trauma bond, or to get it right. Healing our trauma bonds while we're here is one major key to the exit from this construct. I want to say thanks for spending some time here with me again today. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed this content and share with others who would enjoy this too. Thank you.